Salute, my Quick Classics friends. Welcome to another episode of Quick Classics on this Saturday, September the 11th, 2021. Now, as always, if you like the content, please click a like, subscribe, and share. And today I thought that I would talk about Edward Gibbon's 5 qualifiers for the downfall of Rome that he writes about in the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Um, just did a show with Daniel Ott on The Edge where we talked about this, so you can tune in and look at the larger context of the discussion we had. But I thought it'd be valuable to sort of explicate specifically what each 5 of these were in Gibbon's work. Now, many of you will be familiar with the title, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Edward Gibbon was a historian that lived in the 18th century, so he was one of a number of Enlightenment thinkers from that period that wrote on history, Adam Smith being another one. Uh, but the Decline and Fall is this exhaustive treatment of that latter period of not just the Roman Empire proper, but even commentary on later iterations of the Roman Empire, such as the Holy Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire, but specifically dealing with the Roman Empire proper. Um, Now it's not light reading. It is a good book. I don't agree with all of Gibbon's assertions, and many historians have criticisms of them. But I think he hits on some pretty salient points on a number of occasions. Um, but it is pretty exhaustive, and it's written in the sort of flowery verbosity characteristic of period writing in the 18th century. But if you can muddle through that, it is definitely worth the read. And, well, what can I say? It's a classic. And Mark Twain said that classics are those books that everybody wants to read, but nobody wants to take the time to read them. Or one, they're the books that everybody wants to have read, but nobody wants to take the time to read them. In typical Samuel Clemens wit. Uh, so let's take a look at these 5 precursors for the fall of the Roman Empire. The first one is internal conflict, and this broadly includes political, social, cultural, religious, institutional strife from within inside. Um, you could sort of ball them up beginning in what became known as the crisis of the 3rd century, which I'll talk about throughout this. But Rome was now, it was an empire, had been for centuries at this point in time. It was not just the Italian peninsula that we find during the monarchical, or certainly the Republic and partially the monarchical period. It stretched from Britain in the west to India in the east, from Germany in the north to almost sub-Saharan Africa in the south. So we're talking about a huge empire, over bureaucratized, over centralized. The deterioration of the Roman family and Roman virtues was present during this period as well. What you have is an overabundance of pluralism, rather than the Roman state dictating culture. Pluralism began to do that, and that can be a dangerous turning of events for any civilization. And you also had, all kinds of economic issues, which we'll get into in a moment, and military issues as well. People were becoming more distracted by handouts and baubles given by overly zealous senators and Caesars. gladiatorial competitions, blood sport, watching people being hacked up and murdered for entertainment, all kinds of filth and debauchery taking place on the underbelly of Rome. So a general degradation of Roman society proper, but this is happening all across the empire. Um, and of course, secondly, you've got economic strife. Um, Huge economic problems, particularly in the third century. Again, this all stemming from Rome was now an empire. It was expansive. It was getting really too big for its britches, so you had problems with hyperinflation, overtaxation, um, trade disruption. There was a deficit in labor during this period. Um, there was really no currency standard, as it were. Uh, so that all these things are problematic and contributed to what was more than a hiccup or speed bump in the trajectory Rome was heading in. Um, it was a different Rome. It's not like you had the Julio-Claudian emperors like in the first century where they were all part of the same family. Um, but had more emperors in the third century, and some of them were not from Rome proper or Italy. They were from different parts of the empire. You had even people from the east, like Syria. Elagabalus was a Syrian. So um, that economic downturn uh, put Rome in a great deal of peril. Thirdly, because of the overexpansiveness, you do have this, like I said, a bureaucratization, and Rome had become really too unmanageable under one central authority. And so in 284, Diocletian split the empire into a Western Empire and an Eastern Empire, um, which had both good and deleterious effects. But it was supposed to make the empire more manageable. In many ways, it distanced the two halves culturally, politically, socially, religiously from one another. Um, and so that that's probably one of the biggest epiphenomena, which is why it's the third on the list of the internal strife that had been building in Rome for quite some time. Now, you also have a weakened military. This is number 4. Um, the Roman army during this period was not the same army that you had, let's say, in the Republican era. Because Rome was so large, it was taking on conscripts and recruits from lands within its empire. So you eventually got archers from Syria and foot soldiers from Gaul and um, um, you know places like Spain and cavalry. Once the Romans adopted cavalry practices, you had Alans and Sarmatians in particular who filled a lot of those roles. Um, and so that's not necessarily a bad thing, but you also had this sort of exponential growth and pluralism within the empire, under the auspices of the military too. And as is very common, when civilizations run into these sorts of issues, their generals become less military commanders and more politicians, and less order towards national security and more orders towards their own vainglorious ambitions. And so the the military, in short, the Roman army became more and more dependent on conscripts and recruits as the time went on, so that it's almost a kind of most of the army is almost a kind of Roman foreign legion, or at least significant components of it were at this time. And so you've got a disjointed um, military apparatus. Now, fifthly, this is really the nail in the coffin here, are the barbarian migrations and invasions. Now, when I say barbarian, we're talking about peoples from, not necessarily as a derogatory term, but peoples from all over the Roman Empire who are now becoming citizens or becoming parts of Rome. Rome is beginning to hand out, make promises really that it couldn't keep. You know, these Germanic tribes, the Goths, the Ostrogoths, the Vandals, Alans, indigenous tribes from all over Europe serving in the army. In many cases, could do so in exchange for citizenship. In some cases, land, especially. That's definitely what's happening in the East during this time. And yeah, that's it. I mean, um, to put it in perspective, the barbarians that invaded the Western Empire, many had been soldiers in the Roman army, even officers. Um, so that's something to keep in mind here. The sort of turn of events that happens when Rome didn't, for a multiplicity of reasons, didn't keep those promises. The barbarians came to collect the check, so to speak, and that's how the Western Empire fell. And all of this contributed to the, that pushing past the point of where pluralism begins to outpace national identity and culture and policy and that sort of thing. In the East, you do have the kinds of hiccups like that, but not like you do in the West. Um, Probably the worst uh, impact of barbarian infusion comes in the form of the Huns and groups like the Goths and the Alans um, that the Romans had led into the Eastern Empire. They crossed the Danube in the mid fourth century um, in numbers greater than were anticipated. And this tension leads to the Battle of Adrianople in 378 under Hadrian, in which the Emperor Hadrian is actually killed in that conflict. But the East will survive in the form of the Byzantine Empire for another, 100 years, or excuse me, 1,000 years. It's the West that falls and is sort of reabsorbed into indigenous Europe. So I hope this was helpful. These were Gibbon's 5 precursors to the fall of ancient Rome. And I will talk to you soon. Godspeed.